What choice did you make that everyone thought was insane? My Uncle Dominic told me something at my college graduation party that would change my entire life, and not in the way anyone expected. I was 22, fresh out of state university with a business degree, and about $60,000 in student loans hanging over my head. Everyone at the party was congratulating me, asking about job prospects, talking about my future. Uncle Dominic pulled me aside near the punch bowl and said something that made everyone who overheard go completely silent. Listen, nephew, you're a good-looking kid, you're smart, you've got your whole life ahead of you, but you're also broke, and you're going to stay broke if you follow the normal path. Here's what nobody will tell you because it sounds terrible, but it's true. Marry for strategy, not feelings. Young love is expensive. Find an older woman with money and no heirs. Everyone will hate you for it, but you'll be set for life. My aunt actually gasped when she heard him say that, and my mom looked like she wanted to drag him out of the party, but something about the way he said it, with complete confidence and zero shame, stuck with me. 3 months later, I met Patricia Whitmore at a charity fundraiser I'd only attended because my roommate was catering the event and got me in as his assistant. She was 64 years old, standing alone near the champagne fountain, wearing a navy blue dress that probably cost more than my car. We started talking because I accidentally bumped into her while carrying a tray of appetizers, and instead of being annoyed, she laughed and asked if I was always this graceful. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, art and travel, and the terrible music the string quartet was playing. She was funny and sharp, and didn't treat me like the help, which was more than I could say for most people at that event. When the night ended, she handed me her business card and said if I ever wanted to discuss something other than miniature quiches, I should call her. I looked at the card later and realized she owned 3 apartment buildings in the city and sat on the boards of 4 major corporations. Patricia Whitmore wasn't just wealthy. She was seriously, generationally wealthy. I didn't call her for 2 weeks because I kept thinking about what Uncle Dominic had said and feeling disgusted with myself for even considering it. But my student loan payment came due, and my entry-level marketing job barely covered rent and food, and I found myself staring at her business card at 2 in the morning wondering what I had to lose. I called her the next day and suggested coffee. She suggested dinner instead, at a restaurant I'd only read about in magazines. That first dinner turned into a second, then a third, and by the 4th date, I realized something unexpected. I actually enjoyed spending time with her. Patricia had lived an incredible life. She'd been married twice, widowed once and divorced once, traveled to 60 countries, built a real estate empire from almost nothing, and had stories that made my college experiences seem like nothing. She was also lonely in a way that had nothing to do with money. Her 2 ex-husbands had both wanted her money more than her company. Her friends were mostly dead or in nursing homes. She had no children because she'd focused on her career when she was younger, and now that decision haunted her. After 6 months of dating, Patricia made everything explicit in a way that shocked me. We were having dinner at her penthouse apartment overlooking the city when she set down her wine glass and said, "I know what you're doing, and I know what people will say about it." I started to protest, but she held up her hand. "I'm not stupid, and I'm not naive. You're 22 and beautiful, and you could have anyone your age. But you're here with me, because you're smart enough to see an opportunity. I respect that more than I respect the boys who pretend they love me while stealing from my purse." She leaned forward, and her eyes were completely clear and focused. "Here's my proposal. Marry me. No prenup, because I don't want you to feel trapped or desperate. In exchange, you take care of me for however long I have left. Not as a nurse or a servant, but as a companion. Someone who actually wants to be in the room with me." I sat there completely frozen, because she'd just laid out exactly what I'd been thinking, but was too ashamed to admit. She smiled sadly and added, "Everyone will hate you for this. Your family, your friends, strangers on the street, but you'll be financially secure, and I'll die with someone who chose to be here." We got married 8 months after we met at the charity fundraiser, in a small ceremony at City Hall with 2 witnesses we pulled off the street. I didn't invite my family because I knew exactly what they'd say. Patricia didn't have anyone to invite because everyone she'd cared about was gone. The moment I posted a single photo on social media, my phone exploded with messages. My mother called me crying, asking what I'd done to my life. My father sent a text that just said, "You're not my son anymore." My college friends sent a group message asking if I'd lost my mind, or if this was some kind of scam. My ex-girlfriend from sophomore year posted on every platform she could find. He chose a retirement home over real love. I dodged a bullet. Within 24 hours, local news picked up the story because Patricia was somewhat famous in business circles. The headline read, "22-year-old marries billionaire widow, love or con." They used the worst photo of me they could find, one where I looked smug and calculated. The comments section was absolutely brutal. People called me every name you could imagine. Gold digger, gigolo, predator, scammer, prostitute. Someone started a Facebook group called Shame on Whitmore's Boy Toy that got 15,000 members in a week. I couldn't go to the grocery store without people recognizing me and making comments. Once, an older woman actually spat at me in the parking lot and called me a disgrace to my generation. My college roommate, who I'd considered my best friend, sent me a long message about how disappointed he was and how I'd sold my soul for money. He said he couldn't be associated with someone like me anymore because it made him look bad. One by one, my entire friend group cut me off. They stopped responding to messages, blocked me on social media, acted like I'd died. My family was even worse. My mom told relatives I was going through some kind of mental health crisis. My dad told his friends I'd gotten into drugs and made poor decisions. My younger sister refused to speak to me at all and told people she was an only child. Thanksgiving that year, I wasn't invited to any family gathering. Christmas came and went without a single card or call from anyone I'd known before Patricia. I was 23 years old and completely alone, except for a 65-year-old wife everyone thought I was exploiting. The first year of marriage was actually easier than I expected in terms of the relationship itself, but devastating in terms of everything else. Patricia was still healthy and active. We traveled to Italy and Greece and spent a month in Southeast Asia. She taught me about wine and art and how to read financial statements. We had genuine conversations about politics and philosophy and what makes a life meaningful. But everywhere we went, people stared. Hotel staff gave me contemptuous looks. Other travelers made loud comments about young gold diggers and pathetic old women who buy companionship. At a restaurant in Rome, a waiter actually refused to serve me and told Patricia in broken English that she deserved better than a prostitute. She handled it with grace, but I could see it hurt her. The social isolation was crushing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I couldn't make new friends because anyone my age thought I was a creep, and anyone Patricia's age thought I was scamming her. We existed in this weird bubble where it was just the two of us against the world's judgment. My old college friends got engaged, started careers, posted happy photos of their normal lives. I watched it all from the outside like I was seeing a life I could have had if I'd made different choices. Year 2 was when Patricia got her diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, aggressive and likely terminal. The oncologist gave her maybe 18 months with treatment, possibly less. I remember sitting in that office while she gripped my hand and asked the doctor to repeat the prognosis. When we got home, she cried for the first time since I'd known her, and I held her while she said she'd hoped we'd have more time. The chemotherapy started immediately and it destroyed her. This vibrant, sharp, energetic woman became frail and exhausted. Her hair fell out. She lost 30 pounds. Some days she couldn't get out of bed, and I'd bring her soup that she'd throw up an hour later. I learned how to manage her medications, clean her when she couldn't make it to the bathroom, change sheets in the middle of the night, help her shower without making her feel humiliated. It was brutal and unglamorous, and nothing like the luxury lifestyle people imagined I was living. My days consisted of doctor appointments, pharmacy runs, cooking meals she couldn't eat, and watching the woman I'd married waste away. There were no fancy parties or exotic trips anymore, just hospice nurses and hospital beds and the constant presence of death. During this time, my former friends were posting their lives online, and it felt like deliberate torture. My old roommate got promoted to senior analyst and posted about his new apartment. My ex-girlfriend got engaged to some finance guy, and her ring looked like it cost a fortune. College friends had babies and bought houses and celebrated career milestones. Meanwhile, I was 24 years old changing adult diapers and crushing pills into applesauce because Patricia couldn't swallow anymore. Nobody from my old life checked in to see how I was doing. Nobody asked if I needed help or support. I was completely ghosted by everyone who'd once claimed to care about me. The only human contact I had outside of Patricia and medical professionals was the hate mail that still arrived regularly. People sent letters telling me they hoped I'd die too, that I deserved whatever suffering I was experiencing, that I was getting paid for my sins. One particularly cruel message said, "I hope you're enjoying your blood money while that old lady suffers." They had no idea I hadn't touched a cent of Patricia's money for myself. I was living in her house and eating her food, but I hadn't bought anything personal or extravagant. This wasn't the glamorous gold digger life they imagined. Year 3 was Patricia's last year, and it was absolutely devastating. The cancer spread to her liver and then her bones. The pain was excruciating even with maximum morphine doses. She developed dementia from the brain metastases, and some days she didn't recognize me. Other days she was lucid, and we'd talk about her life, her regrets, what she wished she'd done differently. She told me about her first husband who died in a car accident when she was 40, how she'd never really recovered from that loss. She told me about building her business from nothing, about the sexism she'd faced, about choosing career over family, and wondering if that was the right call. During her lucid moments, she'd thank me for staying, for not abandoning her when things got hard. She said most people in her life had disappeared the moment she stopped being useful to them, but I'd stayed even when there was nothing pleasant or easy about it. I told her I'd made a commitment, and I intended to keep it. The truth was more complicated than that, but I did care about her. Somewhere in those 3 years, genuine affection had developed. Not romantic love exactly, but something real. Patricia died on a Wednesday morning in January with me holding her hand. The hospice nurse said she went peacefully, which was as close to a good death as anyone gets with pancreatic cancer. I was 25 years old and had just spent 3 years of my young life as a caregiver for a dying woman, while everyone I knew thought I was living in luxury and exploiting her. The funeral was small, just me and her lawyer and a handful of business associates who felt obligated to attend. None of my family came, even though I sent invitations. None of my old friends acknowledged her death. I sat in the front row of an almost empty funeral home and realized I'd sacrificed my entire social life and reputation for this woman, and nobody cared that she was gone. After the service, Patricia's lawyer, a sharp woman named Catherine Bloom, asked me to come to her office the following week for the reading of the will. I assumed I'd get something, but I honestly wasn't sure what. Patricia had been lucid enough to discuss end-of-life plans, but we'd never talked specific numbers or assets. That week, between the funeral and the will reading, was the loneliest of my life. I was living in Patricia's penthouse, surrounded by her things, and everything reminded me of her. But I had no one to call, no one to talk to about grief or loss or what comes next. The will reading was in Catherine's downtown office, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Catherine sat across from me with a thick folder and the expression I couldn't read. She started with some legal preliminaries about the estate and Patricia's assets, then got to the relevant part. Patricia had left me everything. The penthouse, the 3 apartment buildings, the investment portfolio, the art collection, the vintage car collection I didn't even know existed. The total estate was valued at approximately $38 million after taxes and debts. I sat there in complete shock while Catherine explained the details. But then she pulled out something else, a sealed envelope with my name on it in Patricia's handwriting. Catherine said Patricia had left specific instructions that I was to read this letter alone, after the will reading, and that it would explain everything I needed to know. I took the envelope with shaking hands and Catherine left me alone in the conference room. I opened it and started reading, and by the second paragraph I was crying so hard I could barely see the words. Patricia's letter was 8 pages long, handwritten, and it completely changed my understanding of our entire relationship. She started by thanking me for the 3 years we'd had together, for making her final years less lonely than she'd feared. Then she got to the truth I'd never suspected. She'd known exactly who I was before we met at that charity fundraiser. She'd done research on me after my roommate mentioned I was helping with catering. She'd looked into my background, my financial situation, my student loans, my personality. She'd orchestrated our accidental meeting because she'd been searching for someone exactly like me. Someone young enough to not have their own family obligations, attractive enough to make the arrangement believable, desperate enough financially to actually consider her proposal, and decent enough to not abandon her when she got sick. She'd tested me for months before making her proposal, watching how I treated service workers, how I talked about money, whether I showed genuine interest in her as a person, or just saw dollar signs. She'd been absolutely calculating about the whole thing, and she didn't apologize for it in the letter. What destroyed me was the next part. Patricia wrote that she'd known about the social cost I would pay. She'd anticipated the hatred, the isolation, the judgment. She'd predicted my family would disown me, and my friends would abandon me. She'd planned for all of it because she needed to know if I would stay anyway. She wrote, I needed someone who would choose me over social approval, who would care for me when I was dying, not because they were obligated, but because they'd made a calculated decision and had the integrity to see it through. I couldn't trust family who never existed, or friends who'd disappeared. But I could trust someone with clear incentives who proved themselves when those incentives weren't enough anymore. She explained that she'd watched me during her illness, particularly during the worst parts, looking for signs that I was just enduring until payday. But I'd never treated her with contempt or impatience, even when she couldn't recognize me. I'd been gentle when she was confused, patient when she was difficult, present when being present was emotionally exhausting. She wrote that she'd fallen in love with me in her own way, not romantically, but as the son she'd never had, and she trusted me to use her money better than she had. The letter ended with specific instructions. She wanted me to invest the money wisely, to use some of it to fund something meaningful, and to never apologize for the choice I'd made. She wrote, The world will always judge unconventional decisions harshly, especially when they involve money and age differences and power imbalances. Let them judge. You kept your word when you could have walked away. You earned every cent of this inheritance, not by exploiting me, but by showing up day after day when it was difficult and thankless. I chose you deliberately, and I was right to choose you. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of what we built together. I sat in that conference room reading and rereading the letter until Catherine knocked quietly and asked if I was okay. I wasn't okay. I was overwhelmed and grateful and heartbroken and vindicated all at once. Patricia had orchestrated everything, which meant I hadn't manipulated her. She'd manipulated me, in the best possible way, into being exactly the companion she needed. The power dynamic everyone assumed existed had actually been reversed the entire time. The first thing I did with the inheritance was hire a publicist to handle the inevitable media storm when people found out I'd inherited $38 million. The second thing I did was get a therapist because 3 years of caretaking and social isolation had left me with trauma I hadn't processed. The third thing I did was exactly nothing for 6 months. I lived in Patricia's penthouse, managed the rental properties, and tried to figure out who I was now that I wasn't anyone's husband or caregiver or target for judgment. The money was real and substantial, but it felt hollow without anyone to share the victory with. My 26th birthday came and went without a single message from family or old friends. I could afford anything I wanted now, but the things I wanted, connection, community, belonging, couldn't be bought. I thought about reaching out to my family to explain what had really happened, but Patricia's letter had warned me against it. She wrote that people who judged you in your lowest moment didn't deserve explanations in your highest one. So I stayed silent and started building a new life. I used a portion of the inheritance to start a foundation focused on end-of-life care and support for family caregivers. I'd seen firsthand how brutal and isolating that experience was, and how little support existed for people going through it. The foundation funded respite care, mental health services, and financial assistance for people caring for dying loved ones. I hired a team to run the operations because I didn't want to be the public face, but I was deeply involved in the strategy and direction. Working on something that honored Patricia's memory and addressed real suffering gave me purpose during a time when I felt completely adrift. The foundation grew quickly because the need was enormous, and there were almost no organizations addressing it specifically. Within 2 years, we were serving thousands of families across the state. The work was meaningful in ways my old marketing job never had been, and I finally felt like I was doing something worthwhile with the money and opportunity Patricia had given me. But the social rehabilitation was slower and more painful than anything else I'd experienced. My old friends had all moved on with their lives. They were 27 now, established in careers, some married with kids, living the conventional path they'd always planned. I watched their lives on social media from accounts they didn't know I had, and it hurt to see how happy and normal everything looked for them. My college roommate was engaged to a woman he'd met at work. My ex-girlfriend had gotten married and was pregnant with her first child. The people who'd called me a gold digger and a disgrace were living stable, respectable lives while I was rich and alone and judged. I thought about reaching out a few times, about sending messages explaining what had really happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. These were people who'd abandoned me when things looked bad, who hadn't bothered to check if I was okay during the hardest years of my life. Patricia's letter echoed in my head. They didn't deserve explanations, but knowing that intellectually didn't make the loneliness easier. I had money and freedom and purpose, but I was 27 years old with no meaningful relationships and a reputation that made dating essentially impossible. The turning point came unexpectedly when I was volunteering at one of the hospice centers my foundation supported. I was just there to observe and understand the work better, but I ended up talking to another volunteer named David, who was about my age and caring for his grandmother. We started talking about the challenges of being young caregivers, and he mentioned how isolating it was to watch his friends live normal lives while he dealt with dementia and hospital visits. I opened up carefully about my own experience, leaving out the inheritance part, and he looked at me with genuine understanding. We exchanged numbers and started meeting for coffee to talk about caregiver burnout and social isolation. David introduced me to a support group for young people dealing with elder care, and suddenly, I was in a room with 15 people who understood exactly what I'd been through. None of them knew who I was, or my history with Patricia. They just knew I'd spent my early 20s caring for someone dying, and that was enough for connection. Through that support group, I slowly started building a new social circle of people who didn't judge me for my past choices. They were people who'd made their own unconventional decisions, who'd sacrificed career advancement or relationships to care for family members, who understood that life sometimes requires choices other people can't comprehend. I started dating someone I met through the group, a woman named Rachel, who'd spent 4 years caring for her mother through early-onset Alzheimer's. She was 28, a former teacher who'd given up her career to be a full-time caregiver and was now trying to rebuild her life. When I eventually told her the truth about Patricia and the inheritance, she didn't flinch. She said everyone's caretaking story was complicated, and what mattered was that I'd showed up when it was hard. Rachel understood in ways my old friends never could have because she'd lived through similar isolation and judgment. People had called her foolish for abandoning her career. Family members had criticized her for not putting their mother in a nursing home. She'd lost friends who didn't understand why she couldn't go out anymore. We understood each other's damage. Around this time, my old life started creeping back in unwanted ways. My former roommate, the one who'd called me a disgrace, sent me a LinkedIn message asking if I'd be interested in investing in his new startup. He didn't apologize for cutting me off or acknowledge the years of silence. He just launched into a pitch about this revolutionary app idea and how he needed angel investors. I didn't respond. My ex-girlfriend, now divorced after 2 years of marriage, sent me a Facebook message saying she'd heard about my foundation work and wanted to reconnect and catch up. I looked at her profile and saw she'd removed all the posts calling me out. I didn't respond to her either. More surprisingly, my mother called me for the first time in 5 years. She'd seen an article about the foundation in the local paper and recognized my name. She wanted to meet for lunch and talk about everything. Her voice on the voicemail sounded warm and maternal, like the years of radio silence had never happened. I deleted the message without calling back. These people had shown me exactly who they were when I needed them most. Patricia's letter was right. They didn't deserve access to who I'd become. The hardest reconnection attempt came from my younger sister. She sent me a long email explaining that she'd been young and stupid and influenced by our parents. She said she'd always regretted cutting me off, that she'd followed my foundation's work for years, that she was proud of what I'd built. She asked if we could meet, not to ask for anything, just to apologize and maybe rebuild something. I read that email probably 50 times over 2 weeks. Part of me wanted to meet her, to have some family connection again. But another part of me, the part that had been shaped by 3 years of isolation and judgment, didn't trust it. I talked to Rachel and my therapist about it. Rachel said everyone deserved a chance to make amends. My therapist asked what I would gain and what I might lose. Eventually, I agreed to meet my sister for coffee in a neutral location. She showed up looking older than I remembered, nervous and sad. She apologized immediately and sincerely for abandoning me, for believing the worst, for not reaching out when Patricia died. She said she'd been 19 and stupid and let our parents influence her thinking. We talked for 3 hours about everything that had happened, and by the end, I believed her regret was genuine. Rebuilding a relationship with my sister took over a year of careful, slow trust building. She respected my boundaries and never asked about the money or the inheritance. She just wanted to know me again as her brother. Eventually, I introduced her to Rachel, and they got along immediately. Having one family member back in my life opened something in me I'd kept locked down for years. I wasn't ready to reconcile with my parents, who'd never apologized, and had actually asked my sister if I'd be willing to help with their retirement expenses. But having my sister back felt like recovering a piece of myself I'd thought was lost forever. Meanwhile, my foundation continued growing and receiving recognition. We won several awards for innovative end-of-life care programs. I was invited to speak at conferences about caregiver support. A few articles were written about my work that mentioned my background with Patricia, but framed it very differently than the original tabloid stories. Now the narrative was about a young man who'd sacrificed his social life to care for a dying woman and then honored her memory by helping others in similar situations. The story hadn't changed, but people's interpretation of it had shifted completely. By the time I turned 29, my life looked nothing like what I'd imagined at 22. I was running a successful foundation, managing a significant real estate portfolio, in a serious relationship with someone who understood my past, and slowly rebuilding family connections. The money from Patricia's inheritance had grown through careful investments and was generating passive income that supported both my lifestyle and the foundation's work. My old college friends were mostly struggling with mortgages and childcare costs and career stress. Several of them had reached out over the years asking for loans or investments, suddenly interested in reconnecting now that I had resources they needed. I turned them all down without explanation. The people who'd mattered when I had nothing were the ones who mattered now that I had everything. Everyone else was just noise. Rachel and I got engaged on the anniversary of Patricia's death, which felt appropriate somehow. We planned a small wedding with the people who'd actually been present in our rebuilding years, none of my old friends, just my sister and the community we'd built through caregiver support work. Looking back on the choice I made at 22, I still can't decide if it was brave or desperate or calculating or all three. Uncle Dominic had been right that everyone would hate me, but he'd been wrong about why it would be worth it. The money was substantial and life-changing, but it wasn't what made the choice worthwhile. What made it worthwhile was discovering I could keep a commitment under the worst possible circumstances, that I could care for someone when it was thankless and difficult, that I could build something meaningful from grief and isolation. Patricia had gambled on my character, and I'd proven her right. That validation meant more than the inheritance ever could. She'd seen something in me that even I hadn't seen, a capacity for loyalty and endurance that my old friends and family had never bothered to look for. The social cost had been enormous and lasting. I'd never fully recover the ease of friendship and family connection that most people take for granted, but I'd gained something else, a clear understanding of who I was and what I valued, earned through fire and judgment. My 30th birthday was coming up, and Rachel asked what I wanted to do to celebrate. I thought about the last time I'd celebrated a birthday, my 22nd, surrounded by family and college friends who'd all eventually abandoned me. Now I was surrounded by different people, fewer in number, but infinitely more valuable. I told Rachel I wanted to do something for the foundation, maybe a fundraiser or awareness campaign. She laughed and said that was very on-brand for me, but I should do something just for myself too. So we compromised. We'd do a small gathering with our community and donate a significant portion of my birthday gifts to expanding the foundation's reach. The gathering was about 20 people, mostly folks from caregiver support groups and foundation staff. My sister came with her partner, a few of Patricia's old business associates who'd become mentors to me over the years, David and his grandmother, who was still alive and doing relatively well. These were the people who knew my full story and chose to be in my life anyway. During the toasts, my sister said something that stuck with me. She said I'd made an impossible choice and paid an impossible price, but I'd done it with more integrity than most people manage in conventional lives. A few weeks after my birthday, I got an unexpected letter from my father. He'd heard about the engagement from my sister and wanted to extend congratulations. The letter was stiff and formal, never quite apologizing for the years of silence, but acknowledging that he'd been hasty in his judgment and failed to understand the complexity of the situation. He said he'd like to meet and discuss the possibility of repairing our relationship. I read the letter to Rachel and asked what she thought. She pointed out that the letter never actually said, "I'm sorry," or "I was wrong." It was carefully worded to avoid real accountability while opening the door to reconciliation. I thought about it for a few days and then wrote back a short response. I thanked him for reaching out, but explained that I wasn't ready for a relationship with someone who'd abandoned me for 5 years and only reconnected after learning about my financial success. I told him, if he wanted a real relationship someday, it would need to start with genuine accountability and apology, not careful political language. I never heard back from him after that, which told me everything I needed to know about his motivations. The foundation's work continued expanding, and we started getting inquiries from other states about replicating our model. I hired more staff and brought in experienced nonprofit leaders to handle the growth. My role shifted from operational work to strategic planning and fundraising, which I was surprisingly good at. Turns out spending 3 years managing Patricia's care and her business affairs had taught me skills I didn't know I possessed. I could read financial statements, negotiate contracts, manage complex projects, and make decisions under pressure. Patricia had left me more than money. She'd left me an education in how to operate at a level I never would have reached otherwise. By 31, I was speaking at national conferences about elder care policy and caregiver support. Articles were written about my work that occasionally mentioned my background with Patricia, but now the focus was on what I'd built, rather than judging the original relationship. The narrative had completely flipped from gold digger exploits elderly woman to devoted caregiver honors late wife's memory through philanthropy. One afternoon, I got a call from a producer at a major news network asking if I'd be willing to do an interview about unconventional life paths and the stigma around age gap relationships. They wanted to do a piece on how society judges relationships that don't fit traditional molds and the lasting impact of that judgment. I was hesitant because I'd spent years avoiding media attention, but Rachel encouraged me to do it. She said my story could help other people who'd made unconventional choices and were suffering from social isolation because of it. I agreed to the interview with conditions. They had to include Patricia's letter explaining her side of things, and they had to interview Rachel and others from caregiver support communities to provide context. The interview aired during prime time and reached millions of people. I talked honestly about meeting Patricia, about the calculation involved in my decision, about the social cost I'd paid, and about the 3 years of caretaking that nobody had seen. I read portions of Patricia's letter on camera, the parts where she explained her own calculation and her gratitude for my presence during her final years. The response to the interview was overwhelming and split almost exactly down the middle. Half the comments were supportive, saying I'd made a difficult choice and honored my commitment under impossible circumstances. The other half were still convinced I was a manipulative gold digger who'd exploited a vulnerable old woman. What surprised me was that I didn't care about the negative responses anymore. I'd spent years worrying about what people thought, losing sleep over judgment and rejection. But now, at 31, with a life I'd built deliberately and a community that knew my truth, the opinions of strangers didn't have the power they once did. Patricia had warned me in her letter that some people would never understand or accept what we'd done. She'd been right about that too, but she'd also been right that it didn't matter. The people who mattered understood. Everyone else was just noise. After the interview aired, I got hundreds of messages from people in similar situations. Young people caring for elderly partners or relatives, facing judgment and isolation, wondering if they'd made terrible mistakes. I responded to as many as I could, telling them what Patricia had told me: keep your commitments, honor your relationships, and let the judgment roll off your back. Rachel and I got married in a small ceremony at the hospice center where we'd met. It felt appropriate to start our marriage in the place where we'd both learned about love's less glamorous aspects. My sister was my best man, which would have seemed strange to the 22-year-old version of me who'd lost her for 5 years. But it felt right now. We kept the ceremony small and intimate, just the people who'd actually been present in our lives. No old college friends who'd suddenly want to reconnect now that I was newsworthy. No family members looking for access to money or status. Just the community we'd built together from shared understanding of difficult choices. During our vows, Rachel said something that made me cry. She said I'd taught her that loyalty means staying when it's hard, not just when it's convenient. That the truest measure of character isn't what you do when people are watching, but what you do when everyone has turned away. I thought about Patricia hearing those words and hoped somehow she knew I'd found someone who understood what she'd seen in me all those years ago. The foundation reached its 5-year anniversary, and we'd served over 10,000 families by that point. The model we'd developed was being replicated in 8 states. We'd influenced policy changes in end-of-life care and caregiver support. Major donors were funding expansion programs. What had started as my attempt to honor Patricia's memory had become a legitimate national organization making real impact. At the anniversary gala, I gave a speech about Patricia and the choice I'd made at 22. I talked about how everyone had thought I was insane, how I'd lost everything I'd known for a calculated gamble on an unconventional relationship. I explained that the gamble had paid off financially, but more importantly, it had taught me what I was capable of when circumstances demanded more than I thought I could give. I showed a photo of Patricia from before she got sick, vibrant and sharp and beautiful in her own way. I explained that she'd orchestrated everything, that she'd chosen me as deliberately as everyone thought I'd chosen her, and that the power dynamic had been more complex than anyone understood. The room was completely silent as I talked, and when I finished, the applause lasted several minutes. After the gala, an elderly woman approached me and introduced herself as Margaret, Patricia's college roommate from 60 years ago. They'd lost touch decades earlier, but Margaret had followed Patricia's life from a distance and read about me after Patricia's death. She said she wanted me to know something important. Patricia had called her about 6 months before we met, explained her diagnosis and her prognosis, and told Margaret she was looking for someone specific, someone young and desperate enough to consider an unconventional arrangement, but decent enough to not abuse it, someone she could trust to actually care for her when she became helpless. Patricia had been systematic and calculating in her search, and I'd fit her criteria perfectly. Margaret said Patricia had called her again after we'd been married for a year during her treatment, and said she'd been right about me, that I was exactly what she'd needed. Hearing this from someone who'd known Patricia before I existed confirmed what I'd suspected from her letter. Our entire relationship had been orchestrated by her from the beginning, and I'd never been the one in control. That knowledge was oddly comforting. Margaret also told me something Patricia had said that wasn't in the letter. Patricia had told her that she was giving me a gift beyond the money. She was giving me the experience of being completely judged and isolated for a choice that was actually honorable, so I'd learn early that external validation was meaningless. She'd said most people spend their whole lives chasing approval and never accomplish anything meaningful because they're too afraid of judgment. By forcing me to endure judgment for something worthwhile, she'd freed me from caring what people thought. That was the real inheritance, not the $38 million, but the freedom that came from surviving everyone's worst opinions and discovering I didn't need their approval to build a meaningful life. Margaret hugged me after telling me this and said Patricia would be proud of what I'd built. That validation from someone who'd actually known her meant more than any news article or award ever could. I thought about my 22-year-old self, terrified and desperate, making a choice everyone thought was insane. That kid had no idea what he was signing up for, but he'd stumbled into exactly what he needed. Now, at 32, I look at my life and barely recognize the trajectory. None of my college classmates are doing what they thought they'd be doing. Most are trapped in jobs they hate, servicing debt they can't escape, living conventional lives that look successful from the outside, but feel hollow. Meanwhile, I took the path everyone mocked, paid an enormous social price, and ended up with freedom and purpose and resources to make real impact. My old roommate who called me a gold digger is still working 70-hour weeks trying to make partner at his firm. My ex, who said I chose a retirement home over real love, is divorced and struggling with single parenthood. The friends who abandoned me are living paycheck to paycheck despite their respectable career choices. I don't take pleasure in their struggles, but I do find it interesting how confidently they judged my choice while making their own questionable decisions. The difference is, nobody called them gold diggers or predators or disowned them for taking corporate jobs or marrying college sweethearts. Society reserves its harshest judgment for unconventional choices, regardless of the actual ethics or outcomes involved. Uncle Dominic, the one who'd given me the advice that started everything, reached out recently. We met for coffee, and he asked how I was doing with everything. I told him honestly, the advice had been right, but incomplete. He'd warned me everyone would hate me, but he hadn't warned me how completely isolating that would be, or how long the judgment would last, or how it would cost me my entire social circle and family for years. He nodded and said he'd known all that, but figured if he told me the full cost up front, I'd never do it. He'd bet on my ability to endure and adapt, just like Patricia had. I asked him how he'd known to give that advice in the first place, and he told me his own story. He'd made a similar choice at 25, married a wealthy older woman, endured judgment, cared for her until she died, and used the inheritance to build the business empire he had now. Everyone in the family knew, but never talked about it because it was considered shameful. He'd watched me at 22, broke and desperate, and recognized himself. He'd given me permission to consider an option I'd never have thought of otherwise. I didn't know whether to thank him or curse him for that. The most unexpected part of this whole journey has been becoming a minor public figure in discussions about caregiving and unconventional relationships. I get invited to podcasts and panels to discuss age gap relationships, the ethics of transactional partnerships, the reality of elder care, and the social stigma around choices that don't fit traditional molds. I always try to be honest about the calculation involved in my decision, while also emphasizing the real care and commitment that developed. I tell people that yes, I married Patricia in part for financial security, but I stayed and cared for her through hell because I'd made a commitment and discovered I actually cared about her as a person. Those two things can coexist. Life isn't as simple as gold digger or true love. Most relationships involve some element of practical consideration alongside emotional connection. Mine was just more explicit and unconventional about it. The honesty seems to resonate with people who are tired of pretending every relationship is pure romance with no practical considerations involved. Rachel and I are expecting our first child, a daughter we're naming Patricia. Rachel suggested it, and I cried when she did, because it felt like closing a circle. The first Patricia gave me a life I never could have built otherwise. Now I get to give her name to someone who'll grow up in the world that choice created. Our daughter will never know poverty or desperation the way I did. She'll grow up with resources and security, but Rachel and I are committed to teaching her the lessons I learned, that conventional paths aren't always right. That judgment from others is inevitable if you make bold choices. That commitment and loyalty matter more than approval, and that the truest measure of success isn't what others think, but whether you kept your word when it was difficult. Those are the values Patricia taught me through her careful orchestration of our relationship. I want our daughter to understand that her existence is possible because someone was brave enough to make an unconventional choice and endure the consequences. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.